Yeah, so welcome to our last session of our workshop. So now the next speaker is from the libraries, Wolfram Horstmann from the State University Library of Göttingen.
Yes. Can you hear me with this? Is this on? All right, because I cannot hear mine if I'm on. Okay. Good. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this I think fantastic workshop, which has a lot of time to discuss, and I hope that you already have processed your food and can listen. I had 4 presentations this week, and I was so lucky that all 4 presentations were directly after lunch, so I'm a little bit trained in that. I will give you 5 to 10 minutes to take a nap and talk about a little bit about history, and then you have to wake up. Okay, I will tell you when you have to wake up. So I was asked to say a little bit about myself. My name is Wolfram Horstmann. I'm originally a neuroscientist, but worked a lot in information management, probably as many of you did in the specific subject field of neuroscience. So around 5-6 years, did subject-specific services, and then I changed into the library because I thought it's a very rewarding task to think about what did we learn in our subject-specific work and to transfer it actually to the library domain and think a little bit more generic. So I work here in Cologne, actually. An old colleague of mine sits over there in the Hochschulbibliothekszentrum, and then in Göttingen for 2 years. And then I went back to Bielefeld, where I received my scientific education and worked there as Chief Information Officer for several years. And then I went to Oxford and was Associate Director of the libraries in Oxford. And now I'm back in in Göttingen as the director of the library, and looking forward to work specifically on the topic of research data management there. So I had the pleasure to work in my last 3 institutions on data services in the universities. So we asked the question, how can we actually at a university level support research data management, because it became a topic. And you see this brave new world, we have heard a lot about it. If you have the perspective or take the perspective of the researcher, well, most of you are surrounded nowadays by many different services, and this didn't come out of nowhere. And now you can sleep for 10 minutes because I'm explaining a little bit where this came from. There are 5 major stakeholders, and earlier I looked into policies of these stakeholders that were there: the researchers themselves, the publishers, the funders, the research institutions, and in the meantime, the governments. Does anybody have a laser pointer? No. Okay. So, of course, there's a long history in research data management policies, but particularly in the social sciences. But I think the breakthrough came through a project policy, actually. And this is quite interesting. It didn't come through government policies or funders' policies. As far as I analyzed, it really came through the project policy, namely in the Human Genome Project, which in 1996 already said that they wanted to have all the data rapidly and freely available. And I already mentioned yesterday in the discussion after the DFG presentation that I think that the DFG also was very early on with policy in this area, by asking the researchers to keep the data for 10 years in the institution of their origin. And we had this interesting discussion yesterday whether keeping it but not publishing is malpractice, and that there's a difference between keeping and publishing, which is of course clear. But anyway, I think this is noteworthy that this was there already quite early. The Human Genome Project then produced actually not only a policy but also tools. So in 2001 we saw the first links for GenBank and other services where researchers could actually put the data. So they were not only asked to put the data somewhere but also provided services and tools. The NIH then started also, I think, quite early to have a data sharing, an overarching data sharing policy, which didn't really break through until recently, but they tried already in 2002. I think at least I was surprised to find that already at this point. And then, because I wanted to talk about universities and journals, but also wanted to explain where this all comes from, you found in this area where genes and so on are researched and published, you found the first journals who were actually publishing the data and had a very strict and comprehensive policy about how researchers who publish an article, so literature in this area, should actually deal with their data. So they were asking really for software, the databases, the web servers, and descriptors of all these data. It's already 11 years ago. In the following, many funders came. We also heard yesterday about this, I think, very clever funding instrument of the German Research Foundation in the Sonderforschungsbereiche, collaborative research centers, where they are offering that these can have information infrastructure projects. And also yesterday we heard already a little bit about policies in the UK and the different research councils. The interesting aspect in the EPSRC policy in 2011 was that they were asking the university for a roadmap, how the university will deal with the research data management. So that was the first appearance that I found where a strategy was requested by the funders. And there are many others. I won't go into detail. You find these comparisons about the different policies of the funders. So we can really observe an evolution in this area. And then we find the first policies of institutions appearing. For example, I think the most cited one is Edinburgh, even though there were some others before. Some US American universities have already published policies before. But this was, I think, in the public discussion or in the discussion of the experts, was the one that was considered to be the first, and laying down principles of how an individual university can deal with research data management. You know, the EC came later, and now we have even projects that are helping policy implementation, like the Open Air project, or we have, and I think we also heard about this, a repository of last resort for researchers who cannot publish anywhere else, Zenodo, that is supporting and implementing the European policy on research data. And we find it on national level and finally on the G8 level. So it is really now in the heads of politicians, it's in the heads of the university administration, and it's definitely in the heads of all the stakeholders that I mentioned before, the libraries, IT services, and last but not least, the researchers. In parallel, there were certain services appearing, and Dryad, Jane already told us yesterday about Dryad, where you can publish specific data sets, and also Sarah introduced the different ways of how you can actually publish data sets, and one of them is to have a primary publication of the data set itself, and I think Hans will talk a lot about that later. here in the Dryad example or in the Figshare example, where it's even a little bit easier and more broad, the spectrum of the data that are actually published. And I will come back to that later when I talk about journal examples. And also about that, namely that this is not a publishing of the data set, it's not a publishing of a specific sample or something. This is an article about the data that is being published. And that's a Nature initiative. So I think this makes clear that publishers take this very seriously now as well. So now wake up again. I'll talk about what institutions can do. And in general, I think it is important to look at the different national initiatives. I'm just, as an example, here in Germany, mention the German Initiative for Network Information, DINI. ZKI is another example who is addressing these topics, and this is a very old one from 2009. There are now groups that are working with that, and I can only invite everybody who is working in Germany on that to look at what they do and to participate, because even though this is from the libraries and computing centers, we need the input of the specialists who have subject-specific expertise to influence the discussion of what's going on there. If you want to look a little bit at what libraries are doing, the LIBER, the European Federation of Libraries, has certain activities, starting with the 10 recommendations for libraries to get started with research data management. It's more an inward-looking initiative, but now you will find also, I think, 8 case studies that we have produced last year looking at specific examples of what libraries do. So if you want to gain trust in that libraries can actually do these things and want to be informed about what's going on there, or want to speak to your own library and say, look what they do, then you can have a look at these resources. This study, or this roadmap of the League of European Research Universities, is interesting because it is really looking at the question what individual institutions can do. So not libraries, IT services, researchers, but what the institution can do. This is taken very seriously by your university administration, is my experience. So if you speak to your university administration, point to the LIRU roadmap, because this is addressing the thinking that university administrations usually have. And then you can engage in expert conversations with RDA, we heard about that, and refer to existing repositories. So I do not, if I speak about university services, I do not want to invite each and every university to build an own institutional service, but rather to have a point of contact, a point of expertise, an office, however you will call that. And I think each implementation will look different at each institutions. But one important principle is to refer to the existing infrastructure and not to build anything anew. In some cases it might be necessary or good, and it can be done very lightweight. And I will show you some of these approaches in the next section here about university examples that I had the privilege of working with. So in Bielefeld in 2000, we started I think in 2009, 2010, the internal discussion within the university, also engaging the rectorate and making them aware of what's going on. And indeed, I think it was in 2011, we published the principles for research data management at the university, I think as the first university in Germany. It's just something to raise awareness. It's not really having a lot of teeth or flesh at this point, but I think it is important if there is an email going out from the rector to everybody saying, look, this is what we expect from you. There were central activities that was funded by one post, and I think you can do a lot with already one post, as was shown in this initiative or in this development, because we could build a focus group with the leading academics discussing the principles of research data management at the university, building a colloquium for a knowledge infrastructure where we invited a lot the researchers at the university to present what they're actually doing, also present some of the central initiatives, and the principle was always that a library provides the curation and metadata support while IT services provide servers and storage in that. This also led to several centrally supported research data management activities, specifically to a data service center for business and organizational data. That was a BMBF funded project, and an infrastructure project, an INF project for a collaborative research center. Also, there were collaborations with an excellence cluster, cognitive interaction robotics, and then again libraries providing these services that were mentioned before, and the IT services providing the storage and housing for these. And it sounds trivial, but I think everybody who is doing practical work in this area knows that it's not so trivial. Because usually what is happening that these people, particularly because there are a lot of computer science in there, they will tend to do everything themselves, and they will not talk to the library, they will not talk to the IT services. This, I think, whole work was mainly successful because it had supported the emergence of a spirit of collaboration among all the partners at the university. There are, of course, many initiatives that are already going on decentrally that have nothing to do with the central activities, even though there is maybe talk about it and discussion about it. So, for example, the excellence cluster here had also their own approach of open research, but eventually what happened is that the data that were published there were at least in the institutional repository, and I will come to that later. It had other interesting effects because the researchers plus the library staff really made joint publications about data management. Who would have thought that before? That was about DDI and the Data Documentation Initiative, so they propelled their own subject-specific standards, and with the help of the libraries. The library did a lot of data modeling for them, and the real technical work that couldn't be done in the social science context here was done by the libraries, and eventually it led to joint publications. There were also specific developments of software, but I don't go into detail with this one. And then eventually what were principles before last year became a resolution, and these already had more teeth, namely that there was a coordination center being built and officially mentioned, and also the institutional repository in the meantime was capable of processing data, and but also the principle was applied that it was pointed to already existing resources, like read-through data. So the institutional public repository, I'm always myself a little ambivalent about saying that you have to build your own institutional repository. As mentioned before, there are many things already out there, but there are lightweight things you can do. So you can have a DOI publishing service, a data side DOI publishing services at the university, here in this case in the library, and you can integrate that into the institutional repository that keeps the record of the researchers at the university, so that you don't not only see the publications of the individual researcher, but you also see the data that are there. And there are a lot of methods that were applied in this context that I don't go into detail. The bibliographical data were enriched a lot with mining and using APIs of other resources like EBI resources. But these are really primary publications for researchers who didn't find another place. And even though the number is very low, I always keep it here because I think it's something that is noteworthy. And it's an old slide, so in the meantime there are many, many more publications, data publications. And here you see how they look. Very simple. You have a citation, you have the DOI, and you can even look at the records, so the persons are identified, and you can really build a complete record of the research output of the individual researcher. Here is how an individual data set, bibliographic data, graphic data looks like for a data set on eye tracking. Okay, so the next examples I will do a little shorter because the principles basically were the same. There was also a research data management policy in Oxford in 2012. Interestingly, for the management of research data and records. So it was not only about the data, but also about the records, which I think is a very good approach because metadata are paramount in this area. If you have the metadata right, the data will come after. The principle was also the same in building a working group at university level. It was chaired by the Pro-Vice Chancellor for research. And this is important to discuss all the different interests that are there on the campus of IT services, libraries, researchers, and research office. If you leave them alone, they usually will fight about resources and power. Yeah? So it's good to have university administration somehow involved in that. There were many, many activities already there. And central services were seen as a fallback, so the principles were pretty much the same as in Bielefeld, and was mostly about building the spirit of collaboration between the divisions with the researchers and the research services, so the research support office, the libraries, and the IT services. And the idea was more to link to already existing initiatives and build something like a representative website that links out to the existing initiatives on the campus rather than having a complete new service. Now, in Göttingen, again, the principles are pretty much the same. We bring together the stakeholders. It's a little bit more complicated, not complicated, but demanding, I think, in Göttingen because the target is actually the Göttingen campus, which is not only the university, but also includes several Max Planck institutes, a Helmholtz Center, and a DLR, so Aerospace Center, and the Academy of Sciences of Göttingen, which is building this network of Göttingen campus that is exceeding the thresholds of the university as such. There are very strong IT services with a GWDG and also a library that has a little more tasks than only working on the campus because it has a lot of state functions and serves in certain areas even as a national library. So the situation is a little different there. But also there was a research data policy published this year. Jens Nieschulze was instrumental in that. He is, I think, already left, but he was here. And the idea now is to build the Göttingen eResearch Alliance and to take the two main players, namely the IT services and the State and University Library, that already have a strong history of collaboration among each other, but also within researchers, because there are already many CRC projects and individual projects going on, and it became, let's say, it was a very complex mosaic of collaborations, and it's easier if we have a virtual organization, a label that we can put in front of that and build one face to the customer, to the researchers, and say, okay, we have this Göttingen e-Research Alliance, and we align our portfolios within the IT services and the libraries, also then together with other players at the campus to build a research data management support project. And this is a little complicated, but I think it's at least a first start at a picture of how we do that. So you see the IT services and the library, building the e-Research Alliance and reaching out to all the different disciplines there on the faculties and institutes level, the Göttingen campus partners, and even international partners, because it's naive to assume that we can do everything only on the campus. And the portfolio here is starting with project consultancy, where we are now trying to establish a workflow, at least for the large projects at the campus, like CRCs, that need to have a statement of the e-Research Alliance, how research data management is addressed in the proposal. And this is then reviewed in a commission for research. So these big proposals, they have to go through a quality assurance process in the university, and they are reviewed by a commission. And in this review process, there will also be, it's a side aspect, but there will also be a statement from the Research Data Alliance. And then we build the research data services. We offer staff pooling, because many of the research projects will not be able to put in a complete researcher or a complete position in the project, but they might only want to have 0.2 or 0.3 FTEs. And this doesn't look very good and is not very practical unless you can refer to a staff pooling approach that is existent at the university. Training is a big focus, of course software development services, and also we introduce and include the open access publication strategies to literature publications, but also to data in this portfolio. It's work in progress, and Jens Dierkes is here, who is helping us with the coordination, and other people from Göttingen. So if you want to have more direct information on what's going on there, I'm not pretending that everything is ready here, but this is the approach that we take. Okay, how many minutes?
2-3 more.
All right, so in 2-3 more minutes, the journals. And actually I said already something about the journals, because I think it's most important to understand where the policies from the journals actually come from. Just to mention that 19th of November, it's not that long ago, it was 10 days ago, Nature has announced and informed that the data access practices were strengthened, that reproducibility of research has become one of the paramount features in publishing and will be high on the agenda of Nature. And they do that, of course, also with these specific initiatives that they have launched, the journal Scientific Data, where you can publish data descriptors. So basically articles about the data. And what you see here is they will, of course, point to Figshare, which is also a digital research, it's also a Nature or a Macmillan initiative, but they also point to Dryad. Unfortunately, even though I said, because I'm on the advisory board, they are not really institutional repositories mentioned. So if you look at the list of the data repositories that is also shown here, there is a subject-specific categorization, but you won't find institutional repositories yet. I hope they will be there soon. Another example I had the privilege to discuss with, also through the advisory board, is F1000 Research, who are publishing data, and in fact they are pointing to institutional repositories, starting to point to that. So here in this case to the Edinburgh data share, but there will be others, and they say for other institutional repositories please contact us. So it's a start, and I think it's really happening that this fabric of data publishing initiatives is woven. Okay. So the point I want to make is that I think we need something like data libraries, which is an organized way of representing data in a sustainable organizational form. It doesn't have to be a library, because I think there are several forms of data libraries. One form may be coming from the library or derived from the library as a long-standing institution and a long-standing history of librarianship, with the strength of a service reputation of recurrent funds and the profession behind it. That's something to think about, but with the weakness of having little subject-specific expertise. The other form of data library that we observe a lot in journals or in subject-specific repositories is they're derived from the urgent needs in research practice and build on outstanding subject-specific expertise, which is necessary for research data management, but service not always the culture of research, and actually researchers should do research and not service. And in many cases there is no recurrent funding. So at the moment, and we had a discussion in the break before, I think we need both and we have to support both. But and there are many hybrids. I won't go into the detail of how many hybrids you can find. Just to say that how I think, with the experience of observing this field now for several years, this should be done. I think that the collaboration spirit between the researchers, the libraries, the IT services, the institutions, the funders and the publishers is the most important thing. We're in this together. It's a big task, and it's such a big task that nobody alone can do that. None of these alone can do that. We have to work on a funded policy. That's a big problem at the moment. And why these people are more discussing and sometimes even fighting is also because there are no funding principles available. I think Kevin made clear very nicely and in a polite British way what the problem is. And I would call it actually a problem, that you have these incoming funding streams through the project, and you have a recurrent funding stream that is in the institution, but they're not linked together. So they're not really linked together. And this is what we have to do, and this we can only do with a collaborative spirit. I would suggest to focus on the record of research. This is what stays over centuries and decades, is the links between the data and the literature in the first step. Sarah said something similar, to piggyback on an existing publication system. I think this is very good and very important, because otherwise it can become very expensive. We have to throw away a lot. And a good criterion of what to throw away is what is actually published and what is mentioned in publications. And then the last point is to look at, don't leave the researcher out of the focus. It's really about trying to find something that the individual researcher is benefiting from, because if you have infrastructure developments and infrastructure initiatives, the risk is always very high that you're getting lost in technical questions that have no benefit to the researcher. So if the user story is not there, what is the benefit? There's something wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation from the library's point of view. Are there any questions?
To connect to both funding streams.
within worlds. Or you have to connect them?
I think it has to be done on each level, and it is an interesting question. This is the slide I didn't show. When you think about where should the funding come from and where should it be, I think that actually we need to address this at the government level. The funders are receiving the funding through the government usually. And so the main point where funding should be addressed is really the government. It's a political question. And this is not really working very well. We saw this in the open access discussion over the last 10 or 15 years, that we talked a lot and talked a lot and talked a lot, and what happened at the actual government level, at the policy and legislation level and at the funding level was very little, because researchers, infrastructure providers didn't speak with one voice. And this is what we have to do. We have to speak with one voice, and Germany, with the German Council for Information Infrastructure, which has now been founded, I think is a good initiative to speak with one voice and not to make the same mistake twice. There are but also very, very specific things that can be done in thinking about how overheads are used within the institution, how funders say that overheads can be used, what researchers put in the proposals, because in many cases they just forget or they don't know. So at each level there are specific things that can be done. But I think it would, I could talk a lot about that, but I think it would take too long.
The diagram and the approach of this e-research structure that you have as a vision in Göttingen, could you say whether similar approaches are also happening at other locations, or are there many other locations where similar synergies are trying to move forward?
I think it's happening everywhere, but the idea or the special approach here in Göttingen, which is also applying principles that are everywhere, is probably quite unique. Yeah? There are certain institutions who simply put together library and IT services and build one service. Yeah? Tilburg in the Netherlands is an example that springs to mind, but there are others, but that are not specifically targeted on research data management. So this idea with a label or a virtual organization with an own service portfolio that is laid above the service portfolios of the institutions or institutional departments, I think I haven't seen that before.
I have a question. We heard from the DFG in the presentation yesterday that, for example, only 10% of the CRCs are applying for an INF project for data management, which maybe fits very well to this 90% of data which we might lose in the whole process. So if the researchers in general, let's say in Germany, maybe have not such a high interest in this topic, how would you say now we have 2-3 universities maybe in Germany who maybe address this topic from the university governance level? What would you estimate how many more universities in Germany will join these kind of activities? Will be there pressure from, as you say here, from government, or will it be kind of whoever wants to join can join?
No, I think it's happening. So research data policies are, institutional policies are developed in many institutions at the moment. And I think that there will probably be around 80% in 5 years or so. That would be my projection. It is discussed at the German Rectors Conference, Hochschulrektorenkonferenz. There is a working group that is looking at that very specifically. So we have an expert interview session in December, and the idea is to have recommendations coming out of that for institutions, and usually also this is something that university administrations listen to. And I think I will not predict what is coming out there, but most probably one of the recommendations will be to have a policy. And the central recommendation of the Lero roadmap, for example, is also to have a policy.
I do not see any further questions, so thank you very much again.